Sometimes the biggest battles for dignity don't happen in courtrooms or on city streets. They occur in the quiet of an airplane cabin between two strangers over something as simple as a seat number printed on a boarding pass. This is where our story begins. A tired man, a crumpled ticket, and the weight of assumptions that have followed him his entire life. To most passengers, it looked like an ordinary misunderstanding. But beneath that ordinary moment was a storm, waiting to break, a storm about race, power, and the right to be seen as fully human. What you're about to hear is more than a dispute over first class. It's about the silence we endure, the courage it takes to speak, and the ripple effect when one person finally decides, not this time. It always begins with something small. In this case, it was a seat, a simple numbered space on an airplane. Nothing more than 2 amperes printed neatly on a boarding pass. For most of us, a seat is just a place to rest until we reach our destination. But for Devin Mitchell, that seat became the line between dignity and humiliation. Imagine stepping onto a plane after days of exhausting work, carrying not just your bag but the weight of proving yourself again and again in spaces where you rarely see anyone who looks like you. Devin was that man, successful, intelligent, accomplished, and yet, when he stood before his assigned seat, he was met not with welcome, but with a woman already settled in, her eyes carrying the unspoken message, "You don't belong here." That single moment reveals something many of us overlook. Racism is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is subtle, wrapped in politeness, hidden behind words like appropriate or flexible. It shows up in the dismissive glance, in the assumption that someone dressed casually cannot possibly hold status, in the quiet belief that comfort and privilege belong to one group more than another. We've all seen this in daily life, maybe at a restaurant where a waiter treats one table with warmth and another with cold detachment, or in a meeting where a voice is ignored until someone else repeats the same idea. These are not accidents. They are the small doors through which larger injustices walk in. And the lesson here is simple yet powerful. It's often in the ordinary, in the everyday, that the deepest struggles for respect are fought. Devin's boarding pass was not just paper, it was proof of his rightful place. But for Victoria Hartwell, the woman in 2 amperes, it was an inconvenience to be brushed aside. For Devin, it became a choice: accept humiliation to keep the peace, or stand his ground and risk escalation. This first moment is where the story truly begins, and it invites us to think, how many times have we been asked to move aside quietly, to compromise not because it was fair, but because it was easier for others? In that question lies the heart of this journey, and as we move forward, we will see how a single refusal to give up a seat can spark a chain of events that reaches far beyond the walls of an airplane cabin. And that leads us directly into what happened next, when subtle prejudice turned into open confrontation, and silence was no longer an option. As Devin stood in the aisle, the silence around him became its own language. Other passengers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact, pretending to be lost in their phones or magazines. It's a silence. We've all seen the silence that says, "This is uncomfortable, but it's not my problem." Silence can protect peace, but it can also protect injustice. Devin remembered countless times in boardrooms when his ideas were dismissed until someone else repeated them, and the room applauded. He thought of his days at Harvard, when professors questioned his place there more than his classmates. Each time, he had swallowed the sting and moved forward, because speaking up was often seen as being difficult. But on this plane, silence was no longer safety. It was surrender. The lesson here is that silence is never neutral. It either upholds dignity or it upholds discrimination. Devin's choice was to let his voice break that silence, to say simply and clearly, "This is my seat." And that small act of speaking up transformed the cabin into a stage where truth would demand to be heard. When the flight attendant arrived, her smile was trained, professional, but already leaning toward the passenger she recognized as valued. How often do we see authority figures, from teachers to police officers, instinctively side with those who look like power? The attendant offered Devin an alternative, a different seat, framed as kindness, but really it was asking him to shrink for someone else's comfort. Then the captain reinforced the same idea: be flexible, keep harmony. Authority, meant to protect fairness, was protecting privilege instead. In our own lives, we might recall moments when supervisors, officials, or leaders leaned toward the louder or richer voice, rather than the rightful one. The lesson here is that fairness requires courage from authority. Without it, authority becomes another mask for prejudice. Devon saw that clearly. The system was asking him to compromise, not because he was wrong, but because he was expected to yield. And then came the turning point. A journalist seated nearby spoke up. A student raised her phone to live stream. Their voices cut through the silence. Suddenly, Devon wasn't alone. This is how movements often start, not with a crowd, but with a few individuals refusing to look away. The journalist called the situation for what it was: racial discrimination disguised as a seating dispute. The student's live stream spread the truth beyond the cabin to thousands online. Many of us underestimate the power of witnesses, but history shows us that justice often needs people willing to stand beside the vulnerable and shine a light on the truth. The lesson here is that injustice grows in darkness, but even one voice or one camera can change the course of a story. Devon's struggle became larger than himself. It became a test of whether society would keep ignoring or finally acknowledge what was unfolding. When Victoria accused Devon of trying to scam the system for compensation, the words cut deeper than the seat dispute itself. It was the oldest stereotype that success for a black man must be fraudulent. Passengers gasped, tension thickened, and Devon felt the sting of centuries in that accusation. Yet his voice, calm and steady, became sharper. "I am not running a scheme. I am sitting in the seat I paid for." In that moment, the confrontation shifted. It was no longer subtle prejudice. It was open hostility. Many of us have experienced that moment when bias, once whispered, becomes shouted, leaving no doubt of its intent. The lesson here is that prejudice always escalates when unchecked. What begins as a slight grows into an accusation and an insult. Devon's refusal to bow forced that prejudice into the open, where everyone could finally see it for what it was. Then came the revelation no one expected. Devon reached into his pocket, revealed his identity not just as a passenger, but as the CEO of the very company that owned most of the airline. The cabin fell silent. For Victoria, it was shock. For the crew, it was humiliation. For Devon, it was simply the truth. The man she thought didn't belong not only belonged, but owned the very seat, the plane, and the system she believed gave her power. In life, moments like this remind us that people are often more than what meets the eye. We never truly know the strength, resilience, or status of those we dismiss. The lesson here is timeless. Treat everyone with dignity, because respect should never be based on assumption. Devon's reveal was not about arrogance. It was about exposing the arrogance of prejudice. At the gate, the scene shifted from personal conflict to corporate crisis. Executives rushed to contain the damage, reporters gathered, and live streams spread across the globe. Devon confronted leaders who wanted to bury the incident under procedures. He demanded suspensions, investigations, and real reforms. And when he pulled the data, hundreds of discrimination complaints ignored. It was no longer about one seat or one flight. It was about a broken system. In our workplaces, schools, or communities, how often have we heard of complaints handled internally, only for nothing to change? The lesson here is that accountability cannot be performative. If systems keep apologizing without reform, they are complicit. Devon's demands showed that real change requires uncomfortable transparency and consequences. Devon could have ended there, with victory in his personal battle, but he saw a larger opportunity. Using his company's technology, he announced the creation of bias detection systems for the entire industry. Suddenly, a private humiliation became the spark for public reform. This reminds us that pain can be transformed into purpose when we refuse to stop at personal vindication. The lesson is that true justice isn't only about winning our own battles, it's about making sure fewer battles need to be fought in the future. Devon chose to turn scandal into structure, building systems that would prevent others from suffering the same humiliation he endured. News spread worldwide, hashtags trended, and organizations joined the call. Passengers shared their own stories of being dismissed, humiliated, or ignored because of race. Devon became a symbol, but he reminded everyone, this is not about me. That humility matters, because movements survive only when they are bigger than the individual who sparks them. The lesson here is that real leadership is not about spotlighting oneself, but about amplifying the voices of those who've been silenced. Devon's stand became an invitation for thousands of others to stand too, turning a cabin incident into a civil rights movement for modern times. 2 years later, that same flight number carried new meaning. A plane once remembered for humiliation was now a symbol of reform. Passengers of every background boarded confidently, knowing they would be treated with dignity. Screens displayed commitments to equality, staff were trained, and the culture had shifted. Devon sat once again in seat 2 amperes, reflecting not on power, but on responsibility, the responsibility we each hold to make justice real. And that's where the story closes, not with revenge, but with restoration. The lesson is clear. Justice is not optional, dignity is not negotiable, and the smallest act of courage can ripple into change that outlives us. What began with one man refusing to surrender his seat became proof that justice, even delayed, will always find a way. And as we move into the next chapter of stories, we are reminded that each of us carries the same choice Devon did that day: stay silent or stand. And so, from one man's quiet refusal to give up his seat, we are reminded that justice does not always arrive with noise and fury, it often begins with courage in the smallest of moments. Stories like this invite us to look closer, to ask ourselves how we, too, might use our voices, our choices, and our platforms to stand against injustice. If this story moved you, if it sparked a thought or stirred something in your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Share your reflections in the comments below. Your voice adds strength to this community of truth seekers and changemakers. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Norah Stories, and ring the notification bell. Every click helps these stories reach more people who need to be reminded that dignity is not negotiable and justice always finds a way. Together, we can keep building a space where storytelling shines a light on truth, and where silence is never stronger than the power of a voice that dares to speak. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that stories can change the world. I'll see you in the next episode of Norah Stories.